Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 307 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today, for my commentary, I will be looking at Matthew chapter 27 and primarily picking up in verse 11. Now, I just have to say at this point, it's going to be really helpful if you've read each of the Gospels for today's reading. And when we read all of the Gospels and put them together, we see the reluctantness that we're about to find Pilate, the governor of Judea, in. Now, let's address the issue of Jesus. He's been before the high priest, or the high priest's father-in-law and the high priest. He's been before the Sanhedrin and falsely accused. They basically have brought up false witnesses against him. But their real charge that they were putting upon Jesus was saying that he was a blasphemer. But now they have to bring him before Pilate in order to have the permission or the ability for him to be executed. And a charge of blasphemy is not going to work before Pilate. So they have to come up with something else other than just blasphemy. And so when Jesus is brought before Pilate, the charge that they put upon him is that he is creating an insurrection and a plan to overthrow the Roman government or the Roman rule over that nation of Judea. Now, I did address this before at the beginning of our study of the Gospels and our read here. And I talked about how the Roman historians, and this was just before the birth of Christ, that there was at least two Roman historians who had speculated their prediction, if you will, that the next governor of Rome, the next ruler of Rome would be a Judean. Both of these men, in separate accounts, had speculated that a ruler would come from Judea. So I think this, though it's not addressed in the Gospels, I think this may be one of the reasons why Pilate sort of paused for just a minute, because they've brought Jesus to him and said, this man claims to be the King of the Jews. And I think he's, well, is he? There's this little bit of a hesitation there. And then I think there's a lot going on in Pilate's heart and his life. I'm not saying being pulled towards the Lord as a Christian or anything of that nature. I just think that there's some fear there, that he's standing before this innocent man. I think there's a part of him that sensed this. And there's also the dream that his wife had had, where she warns him to have nothing to do with this man. And I think all of these things put together begin to have a concern on him. And of course, he tries to wash his hands of the matter first by sending him to Herod, once he finds out that Jesus is from the region which Herod was responsible for. Now, Herod is going to mock Jesus as well. Herod is going to be very uncomfortable with Jesus' presence before him. And they will put this robe, this royal robe, upon Jesus and send him back to Pilate. Now, we're told in the scriptures that this then formed a bit of a relationship, or a little bit better natured working environment between Herod and Pilate. I think both of them at first had thought we're being tricked here, we're being fooled here, and then it was sort of like they started coming together because Pilate had recognized Herod's authority, and then Herod had said, you know, I'll give you my authority for the execution of this man, and it's your decision. I'm okay with whatever you do. And so it sort of created this new bond between the two of them. Then we move forward to the point of Pilate still not wanting to really have anything to do with Jesus and the crucifixion that the Jews are calling for. And remember, as I say, they're not saying, well, he's a blasphemer, because Pilate would have said, well, what is that to be? But they're charging him with insurrection, and he's finding no guilt in Jesus for that. There is no testimonies for that. There's no evidence for that. But the Jews continue to persist, and they're saying that if you don't charge this man, then you're no friend of Caesar's. So then Pilate thinks that he's found another way out. It's a Passover season. We don't know just when this tradition started, but there was a tradition that they would release a man each Passover. And when he turns to the crowd and asks who he should release, they cry out, Barabbas. Now, this, I believe, is being worked up by the religious leaders, by those who hate Jesus. And the crowd demands Barabbas to be released. Barabbas was guilty. Barabbas was everything that the crowd and the religious leaders were accusing Jesus of. That's who Barabbas was. It's almost this picture of us. We're a guilty people. And yet, Christ was willing to go through all of this for us, that we might be released. Also, as the Roman soldiers are beating Jesus, as they're mistreating him, I think, and I know this might seem to some, they might not like what I'm about to say, but I just oftentimes think of the religious leaders know that they're accusing a man falsely. They know that they are encouraging people to give false testimony. They don't know just exactly who Jesus is, because their hearts aren't seeing that. But they're bothered by him because they are a brood of vipers, right? They are sons of the devil, as Jesus and John the Baptist had called them. So they have evil intent. When we find Jesus at the cross with the Roman soldiers there, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I don't know if that's just being addressed to the Roman soldiers, and this is where I say some people might say, well, it's everybody. I think, though, there were people there who knew that they were falsely accusing him. They knew that there was nothing that they could charge him with. But the Roman soldiers, they're following orders and they don't know the evidence. There are people in the crowd who are hurling insults and they don't know anything really about Jesus. So they are, I'm not saying innocent, but they don't understand what's happening. And in that picture, I think of a personal experience that I had. And it's when I was living in West Africa. It was at one of the times that the city was in complete unrest. You had two different tribes that were fighting each other. And I had gotten stuck in town because I'd come back in to buy supplies. And when I was leaving was when this battle had started. And so I waited there a few days, and the battle was horrific. Many people were killed. Buildings and homes were burned. But I came to a day that I needed to get back to the village. I needed to return with the food supplies and the medical supplies for our work there and for my coworker who was in the village. And as I left that morning, it was just I and my dog and our Land Rover, and I was living on what would be considered the predominant Christian side of town. I was driving up the hill into the marketplace, which is a Christian area. And the market wasn't open, but the crowds were gathered there. And as I reached the top of the hill, the crowds pressed in around my vehicle. And I didn't know these people. These people didn't know me. I would say that in this city, about 80% of the white people or expatriates, the foreigners who lived there, were all missionaries. And the crowd gathered around my vehicle, as I say, predominant Christian part of town, and they began to shake it. And they either wanted to turn the car over or get me out. The people were out for blood for no reason other than that they were worked up into a frenzy because of the battles and war which had been taking place in the city. Now, how did I get out of that setting? Well, the long story short, my dog that was sitting in the passenger seat, I think it was partly the Lord, but she became quite agitated and began just to let loose. Just spit was flying all over the place. She's growling, she's barking, and I'd never seen her that worked up. And the crowd stopped rocking the vehicle and took a little bit of a step back. And the dog looked at me, and the expression on her face was like, hey, you see what I did? And I mean, really, that was the mindset she had. And then she did it again. And this time the crowd backed up enough that I could drive on out of them. Not to compare myself to the Lord, my vehicle definitely had the strength that if I just wanted to step on the gas pedal, I could have plowed over the crowd. I didn't do that. And I believed that the Lord would deliver, and He did. And even after that incident, I ended up with perfect timing, which could only come from the Lord, to end up in a convoy that got me at least a third of the way to my village, traveling with a armed, escorted convoy. And I was only able to slip into it because my vehicle looked just like the others that was in the convoy. But my point being is, the people who had surrounded my vehicle, the people who were out for blood, they didn't know me. They didn't know the circumstances of the situation. I'm not saying they wouldn't be responsible for what they were doing, but they had no idea what was even taking place. It was a mob. Mob mentality sometimes is the scariest mentality. I am certain that day it was a scary, terrifying event of the people crying out for Jesus to be crucified and for Barabbas, a guilty man, to be released. From the guilty being released and the innocent being sent to the cross. Now, the cross, we've addressed this in times past, it was really perfected by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, but the Romans picked it up and they added their own version to the cross. Why the cross? Well, we know that it's even addressed in the Old Testament scriptures as prophecy of Christ being hung on a tree, or the Messiah being hung on a tree. Now, I know this is where some groups start to split hairs. They say, well, it wasn't a tree. It's wood. It, in that sense, it is a tree that he's hung on. But it is wood. It's a wooden beams. And whether we have the uppercase letter T cross, or whether it's a lowercase with the portion sticking out the top, we wouldn't know for certain. The part of it, though, that would make more sense is having that upper portion that later we'll see a sign will be put over his head saying who he is. And we'll be talking about that in the next commentary or two. But I just wanted to give you this picture, though, of that day as we're leading up to the cross. The crowds are gathered around the Lord, and they're crying out, crucify him, crucify him. And these are the very people who he's being crucified for, the very people who he's going to shed his blood for. And he could have just said, Father, stop it. He had the power to just end it, and he didn't. He suffered in his trial He suffered on the cross, and he was cut off from his Father for you and me, that we might have access to God the Father, that we might escape hell. And today, I want to encourage you. It's not just about having an escape from hell that we come to Jesus. It's that we might have a relationship with Him right now. And this is why I encourage you, spend time in prayer. People today aren't spending enough time in prayer. And read the Bible. I couldn't stress it enough that today, more than ever, we need to be in God's Word, because we live in such a dark time, and a time that the very senses are being challenged, and everything around us is just being insulted by the world. And how will you know what the truth is? By being in Christ, by being in the Word, and by being in prayer. Well, brothers and sisters, I do hope and pray that your day's going well. Until tomorrow, God bless.